let's go to our subject. So first, for those of you who have not had the pleasure of being on one of my webinars before, I'm Claire Membiella. I'm the library law specialist for the Library of Michigan. And this is my disclaimer, just to let you know that although I do have a law degree and a library degree, I can basically present you with information. I cannot give you legal advice. Okay, so we're talking about boards today, and we're going to talk about boards from the perspective of library staff and library directors. I often talk to boards about boards from the perspective of boards and about directors from the perspective of boards. But today we're going to kind of flip it around a little bit. Whether it's, if you do a Google search for dysfunctional boards, you get quite a few amusing videos and a whole lot of, excuse me, media reports on municipal boards that are a mess. And it's hard for me to know if it's, you know, I'm sure there's always been board issues here and there. It seems like just in the 3.5 years that I've been with the Library of Michigan, the board problems have spread and have gotten a little bit worse. I don't know if it's the political climate. I don't know if it's the economy. I don't know if it's just the fact that in some areas population is dwindling. I'm not really quite sure what it is, but in some pockets, we're kind of seeing this trend of board issues and board municipality issues and municipality director issues and board and director issues just in a lot of places. And it doesn't seem to matter what your library establishment is. Very small city department libraries all the way up to large district libraries can have problems. So let's talk a little bit about board functionality and how as a director, how can you help improve your board functionality? How can you know whether your board has functionality? What can you do to mitigate problems before they start? And what can you do if there are problems? So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, why do you even play this board game? And I guess depending on how you look at it, for better or for worse, in Michigan, the way that the library law is set up, all 10 establishment types require a board. Now, when you say board, you know, I mean, you know, a group of either elected or appointed officials. So for 2 library establishment types in Michigan, that means the actual municipal board, either the township supervisors or the city council is their board. But the fact remains is that even though they are the governing board of the municipality, the law places them in the shoes of the library board. So as I said, every establishment type in Michigan has a board. So libraries in Michigan cannot be established, nor can they function without a board. Because the boards in Michigan, so the establishment law of your library creates a legal identity for your library, creates the ability for your library to, you know, to function, to interact with society, to interact with commerce, to create contracts, to earn and spend money. So if you didn't have a board, the way the laws are set right now, the library would not be able to spend money because it's not the director and the staff that spend the money. It's the board that has the authority to spend the money. And then the authority can, the board can then grant the director and or staff the authority to expend money. So functioning on their own, a director would not have the authority to spend money. That's one of the reasons why that if you have a board and you're missing members on the board, you have vacant seats, you have to be very careful, because if you lose a quorum on your board, your board can no longer expend money. So even if you have a board, if you're below quorum, you know, if you have below a majority on your board, the board can no longer allocate money. They can no longer spend money, which means now you may have to get your municipalities involved. So in Michigan, the boards are the boss. That means that the laws invest, or the laws bestow authority on the boards, that they are kind of the overreaching governing authority for the library. That pretty much means that, like it or not, the buck stops with the board. That means the board has total control over the money, over the policies, over the operations of the library. And then anything that the boards choose to delegate to the director is really up to the board. Now, there's practice and there's the law, but the law states that the boards are the boss. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind as a director. It's not necessarily a bad thing because, since the boards are the boss, ultimately anything that goes wrong in the library is really the board's responsibility. So if there's a problem with the finances, or there's a problem with some other misstep, maybe a legal misstep, outside of something like embezzlement or active violence. But if, there's something that you're out of compliance with something, the Open Meetings Act, if the finances aren't kept the way they're supposed to be kept, ultimately that's the board's responsibility as fiduciaries for the library, and it's not the responsibility of the staff. Now, there could be facts that, sometimes this depends on actual facts, but generally speaking, the boards, because they are the fiduciaries of the library, are responsible for everything that goes on in the library. Some libraries actually have two boards. Some libraries have a governing board, which often in this instance would be the municipality, and then they may have an advisory board, which would be appointed officials that would then talk to the municipality about how they feel the library should be run. A good thing about boards is, boards can provide a lot of protection for libraries, as I was saying. The boards can act as a buffer. A very good board can act as a very good buffer between your municipality and the library. So if you're a municipal library, you're a city PA 164 library, or you're a township PA 164 library, your board can act as a very good buffer between you and the municipality. Because with PA 164 libraries and with district libraries, the municipalities in actuality should have very little authority over the library. But as we know, there are some municipalities that like to push the limits of what their authority may permit them to do. And if you have a well-functioning board, that board can kind of act as a gatekeeper and a buffer between that municipal politics and municipal pushing and the library. Having a board, and one of the reasons for why boards were created as the instrument for governing libraries, in some states, the libraries are governed by the state, some are governed by counties, and the reason why boards are a mechanism or are sometimes used as mechanisms to govern the library is because the boards permit the individual community members to participate in the library, to participate in the governing of the library and the direction of the library. So if you look at the library as a hub of community activity, and you look at the history of libraries, particularly in Michigan, where our earlier constitution actually directed that townships establish library and that the legislature put laws in effect to permit every township to create a library. And early libraries were put in schools. The idea was to make the library a community institution and not a state institution. So having a board is a mechanism that community members can actively participate in the library and ensure that your public library really is for the public and really is for the community. Boards can provide less bureaucratic method. Again, if you have a well-functioning board, they can provide a method of governance that might be a little bit easier than having a big bureaucratic government entity like a state or a county manage the library. Sometimes, you can cut through red tape by having a board manage the library because the board can be a little bit more agile in decision making and can switch gears and can spend money a little bit more quickly than some larger entities could. So in a lot of ways, boards can be a very beneficial way to run a library, again, if they're a well-functioning board. So what happens when you don't have a well-functioning board? Well, the ramifications can be pretty serious. You can have, if the director and the board don't work together, then there's fighting, they don't trust each other, there's a lot of miscommunication because they don't trust each other. Each side hears what they want to hear rather than maybe what's really being conveyed. There's no benefit of the doubt. There can be a very big division of the library community, of the community at large. You can have community members that are squarely on the quote unquote side of the director and some that are on quote unquote the side of the board. So as many of you may know, it can get very, very ugly. And it can even degenerate to the point where the two sides are deliberately working against each other. And that doesn't benefit anybody, especially the library and the community. Then there's also issues when it's just the board, and the director really isn't in it. The director is affected by it, but it's really the board fighting with themselves, where you have a lot of infighting, or you have a board that's completely dormant. The board doesn't really do anything. People aren't showing up, and there are instances where bills aren't getting paid and budgets aren't getting renewed. And again, this is the flip side of being agile and being able to quickly respond. If you don't do anything, then it can become a very sticky, difficult situation, because the library could end up in a lot of trouble with creditors, with having the lights turned off, and then you get the municipality involved, and it can get even uglier. You can have boards that kind of form cliques, where you might have a very strong personality on the board who, whether they're the board president or not, kind of decides that they're the one in charge, and they kind of cultivate relationships and kind of are able to turn everything kind of in their direction. And this is kind of like the Heathers scenario of the board, where one person kind of speaks and everybody else just kind of follows. And that's usually the result of like a queen bee or a strong man. You have people who make sure their voice is heard and can either bully or intimidate other people from participating, or it just degenerates to the point where the other people have had it, and they just find it's easier to go the path of least resistance and just follow along. So how do you handle this? So what do you do to deal with a board that might be kind of deteriorating, or if you suspect there might be issues, or if you don't have any issues and you want to make sure there's no issues? If you're currently facing issues, we're going to set that aside right now, and we're going to deal with that in a little bit. But the one thing I want to mention is that I've been researching boards for a long time, and I've been trying to figure out whether there's a magic strategy for how to deal with problem boards. And I'm finding that it's really about human nature and politics and conflict resolution. And one of the best defense in order to prevent or to help yourself avoid a bad situation is to prepare a good offense. So it's like the sports analogy, the best defense is a good offense, which interestingly enough, that idiom has actually been around since the 800s or earlier. And actually the first English usage of that quote is actually by George Washington, for those of you that didn't know that the best defense is a good offense. So it's about preparation. So it's about being proactive. And I know that library directors have enough on their plate, but this is one of these things where an ounce of prevention is worth a whole lot of cure. If you've ever been in a situation where you have a difficult board or you have a problematic board, you know that it is well worth the trouble to try to do what you can to foster a good board and maintain a functional board. And one of the things to remember about boards is because they are members of the community that are placed on the board, whether they're elected or appointed, most of the time, now you do have board members that might have worked in libraries or might be retired librarians or might be current librarians, and that does happen. But the majority of board members are people who their only contact with the library is that they've used one. You hope. So I know of libraries where even the board members don't have library cards. So, sad but true. So, again, your job as a director is you have an opportunity to foster this board. Now, granted, they're your boss. So there is some delicacy involved here, but it can be done. And this is some suggestions that we're going to talk about right now. So your offense, there's a few little tips here. So one of them is to learn. Okay, so in preparing to fend off or mitigate or kind of rebuff or insulate yourself from board problems, you want to learn all you can. Know your establishment type. If you haven't read your establishment law, read it. If you don't know how you're established, ask us here at LM and we'll help you figure it out. Don't assume. If you have documentation, go through your files and see if you have documentation on your exact establishment. Because you may know, oh, I'm a city library. But if you don't know whether you're a city section 1 under PA 164, or a city section 10 under PA 164, or a home rule city library where you're basically a department of the city, each one of those establishment types has different nuances and some differing authorities for the board and the director. So it's important to understand exactly what your library is. And then that tells you the reaches of your board's authority and what they have to comport with, the requirements they're required to be in compliance with. So you want to make sure you know your establishment. Understand how your board seats are filled. Now you may know whether it's appointed or elected, but particularly if they're appointed, know how does that appointment work? What is the process your municipality goes to appoint? Understand what the terms are and how the reappointment process works. A board member can't just get on a board and stay there forever, even though there are some boards where that's been tried. There has to be a term ending, and then either they have to re-up or someone else has to come on. If it's your mayor or your township that appoints your board, go and talk to the person, the clerk, or talk to the supervisor, or talk to the person that does it. You can have input on this. You can suggest, hey, do you have an application they fill out? I'd like to, point some really good patrons and interested, committed patrons. Can I recommend that they go over there? Is there some applications we can have at the library that maybe we can have, if someone's interested, they can fill out and then deliver over there? You could get somewhat involved in that. Know your demographics. Ideally, your board should mirror your demographics in your library. If you have a lot of families with young children, you should have a parent with young children on your board. If you're a very diverse community, your board should reflect that diversity. And there are ways to do it. I'm not saying it's easy, but there are some strategies that you can employ to do that. One of them is to recommend to your board that, suggest a meeting time change. Now that sometimes does not go over well, but if it's never been suggested, you can suggest it and explain why. Get your demographics, get your facts and figures, and explain why. Because at the end of the day, if your board reflects your community and your community feels adequately represented and your library is serving your community well, and when that millage time comes along, your community is going to be that much more willing to hit that yes button in the election because they know the library and they feel that the library truly represents them. Understand the laws and rules affecting the boards and that affect the directors. And we're going to look at those in just a minute too. So, what are the things that not only you should be in compliance with, but have an idea of what the boards have to comply with, because that can come in handy later if you do have problems. You should be the authority on your library. Now, I'm not saying that you should be able to recite the law and you should absolutely know everything at all times, because nobody can know that. But what I always used to tell people when they, when they would say, "Oh, you're a librarian, you must know everything," I would say, "Nope, but I know where to find it." And that's essentially what you should be able to do. So if you should know where your establishment documents are and how to find out. You should know, how to find the laws or the requirements that boards have to comply with, or what you have to comply with. You should know how to find what your rights are under the employment laws. You should have access to those materials. And again, we're going to talk about that today, and I have some nice lists for you. So you want to be the authority on your library, staffing, your own job description, history. You want to be the one that the board goes to know, well, we have a question about how this library works or how libraries work in general. You want to be the go-to for your board. So then you can assess your board. Is your board prepared for success or bound for trouble? There's some key indicators that you can look, you can get a good idea just by watching your board, and just by the things you see them do every day as to whether or not there's a good possibility that there could be some trouble there. And we're going to talk about that as well. Cultivate a professional relationship with your board. Now remember, this doesn't mean you have to like them. It is very possible, and we all know that when working in a professional environment or working in any environment, we all have to work with people that we may not choose to be with if we weren't at work. It could be that there's nothing wrong with the person, but their style just doesn't jive with us. It could be that they have a completely different work style. There could be a million reasons, or it could be just truly you just don't like them. It just could work. It could just be the way it is. But we all know that you have at some point you have to put your big boy or big girl pants on, and you have to just suck it up and be professional about it. There's ways you can establish a professional relationship with your board that can overcome even if you don't really like each other. And we're going to go into that too. As well as your municipality. Look beyond your board, because your municipality, even though they may have limited authority in your day-to-day your day-to-day operations, at the end of the day, if something happens to your board, your library will likely fall into the domain of your municipality. And that's true whether you're a very small city library or whether you're a district, because your district is made up of multiple municipalities, or it could be just 2 municipalities. And at the end of the day, if your board falters, then those municipalities will then have to take control. So it doesn't hurt to become, you don't have to be best friends, but cultivate a knowledge and make sure your municipality has a knowledge of the library and what you do and the operations. And it can be, as simple as just going over and talking to your clerk once in a while. Train your board. Make sure that they see the whole library, that they don't just see the programs and the fun stuff and the little children enjoying themselves. Make sure they see the back rooms with the stacks of books waiting to be put on the shelf. That they see the scheduling with the constant changes and people who call in sick at the last minute. Not from the standpoint of calling attention to problems, but from the standpoint of reality. And this is how a library works on the back end. This is the underbelly of that program that you saw out front and where everybody is happy. This is the reality of on-the-ground library work. So that establishes context for them with which to make a decision, so that that can go a long way towards disavowing that trope of, oh, everybody in the library just plays on computers all the time, which I've actually heard in board meetings, and we all know that that mostly is not true. So making sure they understand how the library works can go a long way towards having them understand why staff are on computers. Inform and consult with them, help them obtain the tools that they need, include them in planning for their own professional development. Maintain training and check in with them once in a while. Yeah, you go to board meetings and everything, but you know what? If you see one of them, a board member in the library, check in with them. Hey, how's everything going? Is there anything that you need to do your, for the board or to do your job well that I can help you with? Don't forget that, I'm always here if you need anything. Did you hear about this FOMO training? There's a new trustee handbook out. All of those kinds of things. Here's some information on the census. Support their decisions. You're not always going to agree with their decisions. The reality is they are the boss. They can make decisions that you don't agree with. At the end of the day, the best case scenario is that you've had a voice in that decision. We also tell boards this, that they're not going to agree with each other all the time. But at the end of the day, once a decision is made, a decision is made. And you all have to stand together to support that decision in front of your community. You want to stand up and appropriately call attention to problems. If you see something, say something. Okay? Don't be complicit if you see constant Open Meetings Act violations, or you see, something wrong with the way they're handling finances, or you see bullying going on. Don't appropriately call attention to things that you see. There are ways to do it. Stand up for your staff when it's right. If someone has, sees something in the library when you're not there, or notices something about your staff and goes to you, support your staff. But as you all know, sometimes you have to maintain kind of this looking at things from multiple perspectives. And once in a while, you may have to bite back that defensive thing and think, okay, well, maybe that time my staff didn't do what they were supposed to do. But if they did, then, also sometimes you have to stand up to the board member and say, look, I support my staff. And again, we're going to get into some really because I know that, it's one thing to say things and it's something else to do it. So we're going to get more to that. So here are some flags on whether or not your board might be heading for a problem. Is your board complete? If you have vacant seats, that's a problem. If you have multiple vacant seats, that's an even bigger problem. You want to make sure that your board gets complete as soon as possible. And if there's some kind of stopgap with that, then you want to see what you can do to help that untangle. If the problem is that the board doesn't want to put in any kind of interim appointment, then one thing you can do is find some patrons that you like, that you think are going to be helpful for the library, and have them go to a board member and give their resume. Have them go to a public board meeting and offer. If it continues to be neglecting, have them go to the municipality and say they want to be on the board. Because in my experience, very often a call between the municipality and the board can be a pretty effective thing. So very often, if you find some kind of stopgap where you have a board that's refusing to fill an empty seat, sometime calling the municipality's attention to it, even if you're a PA1, even if you're a district, so you're autonomous, if you go to the municipality that has the vacancy and say, look, your voice is not being heard on the board, here are some people that are willing to do it, or have those patrons go to the municipality and say, we're willing to do it. So then you're not even involved. You'd be surprised how well that can work. Does your board regularly communicate with you? And this is again a fine thing, because sometimes there's too much communication, but does your board let you know what they want to do? Does your board keep you apprised of decisions that they make, or that they're thinking of decisions? Are you CC'd on emails and stuff between board members? Does your board meet on a regular schedule? This is also a big one. If your board's not meeting every month, for most months of the year, that could also be an issue. Does every board member attend every meeting? Everyone's going to have some absences, but if you have members that routinely are not showing up, then that's another problem that may need to be dealt with. And that would be the board president's responsibility to go to that board member that is not showing up and finding out what the problem is. You as a director could maybe do some fact finding on that to see, well, what's going on that this person may not be coming, and reaching out to see if there's anything you can help with. But at the end of the day, it would be the board president that is responsible for making sure people show up at meetings, as well as perhaps having a bylaw. And that's something else you can suggest is, are the bylaws complete? That brings us, the next one is, do all members contribute? When you go to a board when you go to a board meeting, is the board engaged, or is it mainly one person talking and everybody else has their head down? Is it maybe only two or three people who are doing all the talking? So that sometimes, again, when you have strong personalities, other people tend to withdraw. And that could be a flag that there is a problem on the board. Does your board have guidelines, regulations, bylaws? At the minimum, there should be bylaws. And bylaws are not rules for the library. They're not policy for the library. Bylaws are policies for board behavior. So bylaws are strictly for the board. They could be attendance policies for the board. They could be requirements for, how many times someone can be board president. It could be requirements for things like no conflict of interest. They're rules that are designed specifically for board member behavior. Does your board ask questions about library operations? Does your board talk to you about, well, what happens with security? Or do we have a disaster plan? Is your board interested in how the library is being run? That's also, kind of an important thing. Because I know it's a slippery slope, right? Because you don't, board members that are too micromanaging are not a good thing, right? So sometimes you don't want board members to ask too many questions because that can affect your ability to get things done and your autonomy as a director, right? But you do want an interested board, because that can make your job a little bit easier. If you have a board that's at least interested in how libraries work, they're going to be more interested in not only helping you solve issues, but in helping you move forward. And you as a director can help them by providing them quality information on, you think, okay, well, libraries need to move in this direction. Provide your board with that information on how you see libraries moving and what the major associations are saying about libraries. Help your board learn so that they can make intelligent decisions, and they can make decisions that, maybe even if you don't always agree with, they're at least decisions that are well thought out and are in keeping with what's going on in the library community. Does your board run efficient meetings? So your board meetings run like 2-3 hours. That's a very long board meeting. There are some boards that, get it done, boom, boom, boom. But that can be bad too, because that could mean maybe the board isn't dealing with what they need to deal with. There is a happy medium. Talk to some of your peers. Find out other libraries and how long their board meetings last. You can also go to other libraries' websites and look at board minutes. Now, I know that's not the most exciting thing in the world. And I know that you're probably thinking, well, as if I don't have enough to do. And I totally get that. But if you suspect that maybe, if you're sitting in 3-hour board meetings, you may want to look to see what other libraries are doing. And maybe there's some things you could suggest that to come out of the meetings. Maybe they don't need to sign checks in the meeting. Maybe they don't need to go through, each individual itemized expense. There's things that you could suggest that could make the meeting shorter and more efficient. And I would bet your board would very much appreciate that information. Does your board do its homework? Does it read the board package that you probably spend a lot of time putting together? That's a requirement that could be put in the bylaws, that the board members have to read the packet before they get there. Because again, that fosters good discussion. Does your board stand together even when a decision is not unanimous? or is there infighting and rumors and grudges? Are board members informed and kept in the loop? Or again, do you have this cadre of a few like popular kids who make all the decisions and everybody else is just kind of like, okay, you just vote yes. I've been in board meetings where people are basically just told how to vote, and that's not how you want things to go. So part of this, as we said, is learning the rules of the game. So this screen has, I'm not going to go through all of these one by one because we don't have time, but this is a good succinct list of the major laws that boards are responsible to adhere to. So obviously your board should know your establishment law, right? Your board should know how you're set up. And please, if you're a district library, not only the library director, but the board should read the library, the district library agreement. That's really important. And if you don't have a copy, we may have a copy here. Not every district library has one if you're an older district library, but you know, if you are one of those, I can go into more detail with that with you later. They do have something. It's not quite as in-depth as a district library agreement, but you should still know it exists. Ethics rules, right? So you have every board member should take an oath. You have incompatible offices, so that if you have a board member that's also a city employee or a township employee or you know some other public official, whether or not they can even be a board member is important. Contracts, you know, whether or not you know you can how public contracts work. And you know this would go to things like if one of your board members has a cleaning service business and they want the library to hire them. Local ethics ordinances. A lot of municipalities have specific ethics ordinances that may affect things like nepotism, right? So if the library wants to hire a brother and sister, or the library you want to hire a cousin or a sister or an aunt, if your municipality has a nepotism regulation in their ethics ordinance, that may be a problem. The same thing with the board. It may be that if there's, you know, an ethics ordinance, it may not be possible for, you know, Judy, or let's say Heather, the board president, can't bring her sister or cousin on there, or her, you know, sister-in-law. Employment transparency and financial regulation. This is the big one. These are the more serious ones. So everything from the Open Meetings Act to usage of public funds, and also subject to internal rules. You got to make sure that you know their bylaws are kept up to date and they adhere, and that there are library policies that are in place. And incidentally, one of the bylaws and one of the policies that you might want to think about is that board members don't get special privileges. So if your meeting room prohibits birthday parties, well, a board member can't have their grandchild's birthday party in there. So in other words, they have to play by the same rules all the rest of the patrons and staff have to play with. That's definitely one that I would recommend. You all know directors also have to play by certain rules. If you don't have an employment contract, I would strongly recommend that you see about fixing that. Maybe in another, you know, maybe when your anniversary comes up, or if the board talks to you about a raise or something like that, and talk to your attorney about it. Personally, I think having a contract provides security for both you and the board, because everybody's expectation is spelled out. I think that, so directors are subject to many of the same laws as board members, included in terms of ethics and conflict of interest and open meetings and FOIA, and then also the Library Privacy Act, which is something most board members have never heard of. And then there's also, for you, you have professional ethics. So you have the ALA ethics and other, you know, ethics that you may be bound by because of the profession of being a librarian. If you find that your board is missing some of these, that maybe your board, because nobody's board, you know, very few boards are perfect, right? So chances are that you may have a perfectly good board and there's just a couple areas that you're like, So you can do what you can to look at those areas and offer what assistance you can. Again, you're not the boss and they are your boss, so there may be a limit to what you feel comfortable doing. But there are definitely, depending on which pieces you find missing, you can help with. Again, we talked about vacancies, right? You can talk to members of the public that might be good board members and encourage them to apply. You can always consult and inform your board. You can always slip extra information into those board packets. You can also always send emails out with links to information that might be useful. Hey, did you know that in Michigan, the Open Meetings Act, requires this? Here's the guide to the Open Meetings Act. I found this and I think this is really useful. You're not telling them they're doing anything wrong. You're just calling their attention to what they're supposed to be doing right. And hope that they take a look at it. And I would bet at least one or two of them would, especially if your board is basically a good, well-functioning board. Chances are someone's going to look at it and say, oh, well, maybe we're not doing that right. If you suspect a big problem, ask for help. Talk to your co-op director. They're a very good resource. Talk to us. You can call me. You can call my boss, Shannon. You can call, a myriad of people here in a whole lot of different areas. And if you call me and you're looking for example, you have questions about state aid or penal fines, or you have questions about youth things, I will send you on to the proper person. If it's something I can help you with, I will do the best I can to help you. Talk to your attorney. You should have a library attorney, not your city attorney, not your township attorney, your own library attorney. I know in many municipalities, they try to convince the library that it's okay, use the city attorney. Even boards, because of the cost of attorneys, will try to put forth the argument that there's no reason why they can't use the municipal attorney. There is a big reason why they can't use the municipal attorney, and it's called conflict. The municipal attorney, by definition, their primary client is the municipality. Their primary client is not the library. And they're most of the time not well versed in library law, which can be a little specific. It is well worth the money to retain a true library lawyer who not only knows the ins and outs of particular issues pertaining to libraries, but also will represent your interests and not the interests of the city and then the interests of the library as a second thought. Sometimes that's a hard sell to a board, but if you need any help, let me know. I'd be more than happy to speak on your behalf. And you can also go to your municipality. The municipality are not always the bad guys. There are some instances when it can be very useful to go to the municipality. So let's spend a little more time on cultivate. We talked about cultivating relationships. Again, sometimes it's just about one-on-oneing. Talk to your board when you see them. Talk to board members. So, why'd you come on the board? And hey, what can I do to help you in this role? What is their preferred method of receiving information? Do they prefer copies? Do they prefer email? Sometimes people just like to know they're being, they just like attention, right? When a new board member comes on, make them part of the library. So give them a name tag. If you have name tags, give the board member a name tag. Give them an email, a library email. That's important, not only because it will make them feel more like a part of the group, but it also, from a FOIA standpoint, is very important. If they have a library email and they do all their board stuff on a library email, then if there's a problem, or if someone FOIAs information dealing with a particular, say, decision of the board, then they don't have to worry about their personal email being subpoenaed or being FOIA'd. Which would be, if they're using their personal email for board business, they are open to because it's public record, they are open to it being FOIA'd. Make sure they have a library card. That may seem obvious, but again, you'd be surprised how many boards I come in contact with who do not have library cards. Officially welcome them. If you're able to, make kind of a big deal out of it. If you have a little bit of swag and you can afford to give it to them, give them some swag. Give them a tour of the library, and not just, as I said, the fun parts of the library. Show them your beautiful building, show them the collections you're so proud of, but also show them the behind the scenes. Show them your office that has, here's the invoices, here's all the books that are waiting to be processed. Show them the workroom. Show them how the mail comes in. Show them how a book goes from a box to the shelf. Show them how a book goes from the order to the shelf. Get them involved, show them the whole process. Doesn't have to be all at once, but make sure, again, that they really understand how the library works. You wouldn't expect the governing board of Coca-Cola to not understand beverages, and you wouldn't expect the governing board of Apple to not know what a computer is, right? So it's the same idea. If they're going to be making decisions about the very operation of the library, and they have the potential to have a huge impact on how you do your work and how services are given to the community, it's doing a disservice to you and to them to not give them the information they need to understand the impact their decisions can have. And that doesn't mean that they have to become an authority, because that's why they have you, but at least give them context. Because if they don't have context, you almost can't fault them for making decisions that don't make any sense, right? Get to know colleagues in your municipality, as I mentioned, your clerks, your treasurers who handle your PPT, your millages, your state aid. Understand how those checks go. Do they go directly to the library? Do they go to your municipality? Talk to the people who handle them and make sure they understand what these things are and how they work. Just get to know their troubles. What they may say, it's so hard to get this to you, and I don't, I guess my point is, sometimes the best way to cultivate a good relationship with clerks and treasurers are to consider them allies rather than opponents. And I'm not saying that you all are doing that now, are automatically assuming they're opponents, but to be honest, we all know that there are a lot of frustrations and troubles that can emanate from the municipality's dealings with the library. So I think my experience is that if you reach out proactively and talk to them once in a while and let them know where you're coming from and educate them on how what they're doing affects the library, a lot of them are open to that. Again, a lot of times conflict comes from lack of trust and misunderstandings, and you can look that up. That's a lot of times the worst conflict comes from those two things. And the way to build trust is to build a relationship. And it doesn't have to be a close relationship, but you have to have contact. And to build that contact, it can be semi-annually. You go over there. It can be just if you think you might like the person personally, once in a while, I'll ask you if you want to have lunch. There's a lot of different ways to do it. It doesn't have to be onerous, and it doesn't have to be all the time. And the time put in, I can tell you, can be extremely worth it when you need it. Training. When you're going to train, make sure you train new trustees, right? So you want to make sure that you have a planned process with documentation. Give them a trustee handbook, make sure they know the establishment law, make sure they have job descriptions, especially yours, including guidelines for contact. If you have an opportunity to talk about your job description, one of the things I would recommend is think about how your board contacts you, and whether it's appropriate for them to contact you at all hours of the day and night. So do they have your cell phone? Do they text you? And that's something that you can set guidelines on, right? You can determine whether or not you want to receive texts constantly from your board. And that's a discussion that you can have. And you could conceivably put that in a job description. You want to make sure that in addition to individual orientation, when new trustees start, that there is a group training at least once per year. Could be their annual retreat. Offer to coordinated training. Either you can train them, you can bring in a co-op director, you could bring me in, you could bring my boss in, you could bring in Shirley Bursama, who does, from FOML, who does board training. There's a bunch of different people you can bring in. Again, there's some excellent options for things like conflict resolution, it can be really helpful. Even if you're not having a conflict, it can be really helpful. Encourage regular spotlight viewing training via videos through like United for Libraries or Web Junction. Either send them lists of videos and links that they can get to. Maybe suggest that in the meetings there's an extra 10 minutes put aside to look at a video. You can even say, you know, I'm going to give you these links, and the first one of you to watch it gets a library tote bag, and you know, we can actually help you with those metrics of whether or not someone has watched something. Encourage and enable outside trustee development. This is something that I think falls in the cracks a lot. It's important that directors and staff get outside professional development, and it's important that boards get it. Through United for Libraries, through FOML, the Friends of Michigan Libraries, through us at LM. It can be through webinar from Web Junction. The co-ops do trainings. You know, there are different areas of the state where different groups of libraries get together and just their boards all get together for things. I mean, there's different, you as a library director could talk to other libraries in your area and say, hey, how about we get all of our boards together and we bring in someone for training? Or, you know, whatever, it could be or each of us takes, 20 minutes and tells, shows them something new about libraries. There's a lot of different things you could do. And yet time is an issue, I get that. But again, if you can space it out and you can manage to fit it in, that little bit of investment can really pan out later. If you can bring in outsiders to train, there's actually a surprising number of people that will come in and talk for free, both from your municipalities, from MSU Extension, from UM. There's a ton of people, and if you need some help finding someone on a particular topic, give me a buzz. I'd be happy to help you. So consulting them, communicating with them, plus following up with them can equal trust, right? So consulting is asking and notify, right? There may be, especially if you don't have a good relationship with your board, your first instinct might be to hide things. And I don't mean hide things in a bad way. I mean hiding because you don't want to deal with it. It's too much of a pain. And you're worried about, starting a whole kerfluffle. You know what? Start with something small that's not going to be a kerfluffle and start notifying them. You would be surprised how well they respond to that. And that can foster trust. Follow up. If they issue concerns or questions to you, no matter how silly those questions may seem, follow up with them. And again, that builds trust. At the end of the day, speak truth to power, right? And again, this is I'm not saying this is easy, but again, studies have shown, and conflict management courses will tell you that if you can do it professionally and calmly, and you have facts and authorities to back you up, people will tend to listen, right? Call it, if you take the emotion out of it and the accusations out of it, people tend to listen. Call attention to issues and problems. Again, respectfully. The board may not know they're doing anything wrong. Again, this kind of goes back to, they don't know a whole lot about libraries, and they may never know, they may have never heard of the Open Meetings Act, okay? Some of them may not have any clue. They may not know that, they have to, they can't put their, petty cash in a coffee jar. They just, you'd be surprised. I'm not saying any of them are stupid. I'm saying that they may not have experience in this arena. So they may just not understand. You can, if you bring up some issues, you can actually save them money and end up being the hero because you've prevented them from stepping their foot in it and getting embarrassed. If you see a problem that is severe enough, that is a severe violation of the law, or that involves public money, be prepared to whistleblow to the appropriate authorities. Let's talk for a minute about what to do when things go bad, because we're almost out of time. The main thing that I want to tell you, because I know when things go bad, it can be awful, right? It can be really awful. Document, okay? Keep track of things. Keep copies of minutes. If you can, keep minutes in the library. Make sure the minutes get posted. Keep your written notes, right? If you have to keep them separately, keep them separately. make sure you understand the claims, the problems you have, and back it up with facts and the law or the rule, so that you have a good basis to stand on. And if you need help with that, reach out. Know the bylaws, right? And be prepared to bring up bylaws that may be being infracted. Know your rights. Know your employment rights, right? Know things like your wage and hours laws, right? When you're entitled to overtime, if you're entitled to overtime, under what circumstances can you be fired? What are your privacy rights? Again, with communication, when does communication turn into harassment? Ethics. Does your municipality have an ethics ordinance? What does it say? Wiretapping, and I have a little star there because the law says that if you're a participant in a conversation, you can record that conversation without the other people knowing. And I'd be happy to send you the statute if anybody wants to see it. So if you have a board member that's abusing you, tape it. Tape a conversation. You can refuse to talk to them. You can tell them, look, I do not have to put up with this. When you're prepared to talk to me in a professional way, I'd be more than happy to talk to you. And as long as you're calm and you're non-threatening, nothing can come back to you. You are in the right. And yeah, in some instances, Michigan is an at-will state and you can be fired on the spot, but there are also things that mitigate that at-will. Things like if you have an employee handbook, if you have an employment contract, those things can affect the ability of employers to implement at will. So it's important that you understand these kinds of rights so that you know what options you have. Stand up to things that you know is bad. There are different trainings that you can do for conflict management. And like I said, there are some that are free. And they're really good, and they show you how to deal with that moment when your heart turns to ice and your stomach drops and someone is basically attacking you. I'm a very emotional person, right? So I've been in situations with miserable bosses and bad situations, and taking that training has made a world of difference, right? So it really does give you your voice back, and it gives you powerful tools to deal with people who ultimately are just either mad with power or bullies. So you do have options. And again, I have a slide here at the end that presents those options on how you can get that training. Ask for help. You're not alone. It's really important to know that you're not alone. Okay? Contact your attorney if you have one, your library attorney. Even though technically they work for the board, they will help you. Don't be afraid to contact us. I have plenty of people that contact me just to vent. You can just call and yell at me. You can call and cry at me. You can call and vent all you want. And even if I don't have a perfect solution for you, I'm always willing to listen. I'm always willing to come out and have your back at a board meeting. So, reach out. You are not alone. I can tell you that there are tons of libraries right now where the library director and the board are having difficulties. It's not you. You're not alone. It could be just a personality problem. Don't feel like it's your failure or that you're the one who's doing the wrong thing. There could be many, many reasons, and very often it's a combination of things, and just know that you're not alone. And you do not have to put up with abuse. I have like a minute left. It's important to note that the nuclear option is to remove board members. And that can be very problematic. If you have elected board members, in some instances they can be recalled, but if you're a district library, whether they're appointed or elected, they can only be removed by a process that involves the governor. It's not an impossible process, but it's a very long and drawn out process. And most of the time it is not successful. So you have to assume, particularly in a district library, that removal is not an option. One of the things you have to do is look at their term, see when their term is up, find someone to replace them. And this can be when your municipal relationship can be super handy. If you have that good municipal relationship, that would be the time to use it. Go and talk to the person who appoints the board members, or, you know, talk to the clerk who does the elections. Say, I'm sending in people to get on the ballot. You know, can you help them out? Because you'd be surprised how handy it can be to have a relationship with someone in those positions. And so all of that work you did to foster those relationships with your municipality come in very handy when things start to go wrong. If you, again, going back to, if you see legal issues, if you see board members committing legal problems, sometimes going to the municipality can be very helpful. Again, you see Open Meetings Act issues, sometimes sending a note to the board president and CCing the city attorney can be extremely helpful, because if you're a municipal library, the municipality doesn't want to be known as the municipality that has open meetings problems, right? And some municipalities feel very tied to their libraries, even though they don't have control of them. So my experience is that if you CC in that city attorney, the city attorney is going to nudge either the board member or is going to nudge someone in the city hierarchy to then talk to that board member. And it all kind of happens behind the scenes. So that's one option that can be helpful. Olive problems can be so situational that not any one thing I suggest is going to work for everybody. But one of the main things I was hoping to get through with this is that you do have options. So I want to thank you for participating. I'm going to send my slides to everybody right at the end of this discussion. And thanks for coming. I hope everybody has a really great holiday. And any questions, I will answer on the email. Thanks a lot for everybody for coming. I hope you have, again, a really great holiday.